There are so many themes to talk about when discussing the last few centuries of interaction between European and African peoples. Esheru and I are practically bursting at the seams to include as much as possible. The points raised will be picked up upon in greater detail as we make our way through our series. Suffice to say, we will be presenting different perspectives to those more readily expressed in European mainstream media, and we hope that people who disagree with us will bear with us and hear us out. As we ourselves know that other perspectives hold merit, we hope our dissenters might also consider the merits of our arguments. My thanks as always to Esheru for the tireless work that he does in trying to educate even the most offensive of social media respondents, and for his time and dedication. I salute him. Turn the mic, clocking out. Enjoy.
Dung weche pek kod welo mabiro etu under mic. Dung parodit kod jok mawuoye etu under mic. Seche tin sud buta wawinji etu under mic. Wola wachokre, wabed piny, bi wawinje, ero chako, dungo mit ndi, and a mic. Podcast makende.
I'm joined by Esheru, a person who has become a friend. I'm proud to call a friend, but more importantly than that, even a political activist and somebody who is a political commentator of some depth and thought. Esheru, how are you?
I'm very well, thank you, Zach. Thank you for that very warm welcome. It's nice to be back once again. I'm also proud to call you a friend. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, it's been some time, but time unfortunately doesn't follow our wishes. We've wanted to speak quite often. Other important things have come up, and we're both busy in our own ways. We also have jobs, so it's not as though we are paid for doing this political commentary stuff. But we've got a really interesting mini series that we've planned, inspired by you, of course, and I wanted to invite you to speak about it a bit.
Absolutely. Well, the thing is, we live in the information age, and there's a lot of information available on our fingertips, but often it's not always possible to get the right information because there's so much. A lot of conflict happening in various parts of the world. We're hearing a lot about what's happening in the Middle East. We hear about small conflicts in other parts of Asia. But I think one of the areas that we have very little light shone upon is what's happening in Africa. And a lot of it has to do with the fact that most people probably think it's internal or tribal wars, etc. But I think that it's a good area for us to kind of look at, just to highlight some of what's happening in various regions in Africa.
Yeah, absolutely. And one of the focal points of our discussions, I believe, will be about the levels of hypocrisy which are introduced in all of the international organizations, international relations, trade, negotiations, methods of doing business, principles, democracy, all of these things. And they are all highlighted pretty much from the beginning of, shall we say, relations between African peoples and Europeans a few hundred years ago. And ever since then, it's just been one event after another.
Absolutely. I think what our listeners should think about is, certainly those who follow me on Twitter, or what was formerly known as Twitter, but now called X. I do discuss a lot of the hypocrisies that we find around the reporting of what's happening in Africa, especially when you hear people say, well, why don't they just stay at home, or why do they have to come here, and why don't they stay home and build their own countries? And, if they put themselves in the people who are fleeing, put themselves in their shoes, a lot of people don't want to leave where they're living, right? They want to stay at home, right? I mean, I've been to West Africa several times, and I can tell you West Africa is a very beautiful place. There's a lot happening there. Sunshine, fresh food. I mean, who wants to leave that and come to a cold, miserable Europe, right? Now, I'm not saying Europe's bad, but I mean, most people prefer to stay at home. These people travel. These people make these journeys because it's something they need to do to survive. Africa, as you know, has an abundance of resources. It could be self-sufficient. Why do these people have to flee? Why can't they stay? It's because the resources are being exploited. Money's being siphoned off. They're not benefiting from it as a result. They have to go in search of money to take care of themselves and their families.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, you touch on points there, which I'm pretty sure we're going to go into more detail later on in the series. But people have to realize, though, that the impact of hundreds of years of foreign policy directly in Africa and African nations has an impact today. But not only those past actions, which have deprived many African nations of people, of resources, of a wealth of and time to grow within their own cultures, but even today there is a constant feed on African resources at, shall we say, on terms which are definitely not beneficial to local interests.
Absolutely. Let's remember, we had colonialism, and at the end of colonialism, globalism began. Transnational organizations and corporations were created not solely for, but eventually to be able to continue exploiting the resource-rich areas of Africa and various parts of the world. Unfortunately, the way that these organizations and institutions are sold to us in the West is that they're doing a good job in helping these poor people out of poverty. But since colonialism ended 60, 70, 80 years ago, none of these countries seem to have benefited as a result. So it's given with one hand, but taken back with two or three. And that's the situation Africa and various other resource-rich poor nations find themselves in. It's a vicious circle.
Yep, absolutely. You've very generously in the past indicated some reading material for me to learn a lot more about some of the history. And I have taken advantage of a few of these books, and I'll put some into the podcast notes as we go through the series as well. We've been talking about one as well throughout today. And if I quickly fire up the particular one, it's The Psychosis of Whiteness by Kehinde Andrews. And there was a very interesting, obviously, which is a silly thing to say, hundreds of interesting points made within the story. But you today, while we were talking, you referred me back and you reminded me of the introduction. And this is going to be a slightly longer question, so please forgive me. But you mentioned the mediocre white people who have risen to prominence, which are referred to in the introduction. And we also watched together on Breakthrough News this episode where they talk about why the US government is censoring African media. And therein lies another form of hypocrisy, because on the one hand, you've got mediocre people in positions of power. And on the other hand, you've got this discriminatory supremacy, which tries to make reasons for their opinions on African people's intelligence, shall we say. Do you want to talk a bit about that?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, mediocre white men was the phrase that Kehinde Andrew used, and it's actually a phrase I've used online quite a few times on my timeline on X. And what you have is, and I'll go far as to say that the standards that black and brown people are held at, the high standards, those mediocre white men will never hold those standards themselves. They hold us into a higher regard. They expect more of us, but they themselves never reach that level. And I mean, we can use Boris Johnson and Donald Trump as two prime examples, and Jair Bolsonaro as well from Brazil. Three white men born into privilege, end up running their countries. And if you look at the COVID outcomes of Brazil, Great Britain, and the United States of America, three worst outcomes of all the countries across the globe. And again, these white men, because of the level of propaganda is not the right word, but we're force-fed this narrative that whiteness is greatest, and because people buy into that, people would prefer these mediocre men over well-qualified well-experienced black, brown person or a female, right? This is just the world that we live in.
Yeah, indeed. And this is the great hypocrisy where you've got these kinds of individuals who are clearly not up for the job. As in, if they went for an interview for those jobs, or even 10% of those jobs' responsibilities, they would never be allowed the position by a proper panel.
Absolutely not. And this is the thing. I think that politics, and this is a discussion I was actually having today with a couple of friends, and I believe that politics today has become very much a hiding place for those who have actually failed in business and commerce. Because when I look at people like David Cameron, for example, David Cameron wasn't able to get a job. I think he tried several times to get himself a position, and in the end, he had to get the help of, I believe it was his mother-in-law or his father, I can't remember which one, to actually get him a job. And then, of course, he was out on Civvy Street for a few years before he went into politics. A lot of these politicians, and I'm not knocking anybody in middle management, but a lot of them probably wouldn't get to all the middle management in any organization up and down the country. They're not very intelligent people. They come from money. They got a bit of privilege, privately educated. Through their education, they're able to make contacts, and this is how they've got to where they are. I have a master's, and I'm not bragging. I speak several languages, and I come from a very, very modest background, very normal working class background. I'm better qualified than anybody that sat on the Brexit negotiating team in terms of what's happening in and around Europe. But there they are, earning six-figure sums, pontificating about what's best for Britain. But a posh suit and an accent, sorry, a tailor-made suit and a posh accent, it does mask stupidity.
Yeah, exactly. And again, when we refer back a little bit to also the book, because I took some interesting notes, and it's funny that we talk about things and it seems to coincide almost exactly with some of the statements that are made. But basically, we're talking about mediocre men here, and we're talking about people who rose to prominence, and would also include all of the UKIPers, and we can include all the reform people within that blanket, as it were. And what's interesting is whenever their support has in some way fallen away, they have returned to what was written in the book, old-fashioned racism, as being a comfort blanket. Because even when they screw up, all they have to do is simply go back, become a bit more extreme, a bit more radical, and then their support is right back with them.
Absolutely. And I think what people, we know how the media works, right? And if, let's just say, having a bad news day, or they want to bury something, if they're talking a lot about people in boats, if they're talking about young black men, or if they're using a racism angle for days on end in the media, try and have a look at what's going on in the background, because they do use it to cover their mishaps, their mistakes, and also to hide bad news.
Yeah, exactly. The bad news which they have created themselves.
Absolutely, it's a way to divert attention away from their own fuck ups, if you will.
Interestingly enough, then, so this also refers us back to the kind of language which they use to normalize their discriminatory relations with Africa, and this is kind of leaning on the topic that we thought about when we were looking at the breakthrough news item, was that whenever they, and I say they, I will talk about the West, America and European countries, whenever these nations want to in some way bring down any kind of idea or ideology which would support civil rights or the rights of people of color, and this was the case also with apparently how they referred to Martin Luther King as being a Soviet, or a person who was following Soviet guidance. But this particular news agency, they also tried to claim was basically a mouthpiece for Putin. Now, we know from the days of imperialism, when they used to write stories and articles for the British public, when they were out there in whichever area of the world they wanted to subjugate and steal from, they used to say, oh, we have brought civilization to these people. They haven't got a single idea about the way of life, and so on. Yep. How long can we realistically continue as a society to believe this bullshit?
Well, the thing is, again, this is another conversation. I mean, I have these conversations daily. I think the two things I blame, I blame poor education. And I'm not knocking the hard work that teachers do at school, because a lot of teachers do get their heads down and they're dedicated. I'm talking about once you leave school, every individual owes it up to themselves to at least pick up a book and understand the ways of the world, right? Because school didn't really teach me much. It taught me how to count, it taught me how to read. But understanding the world, I had to pick up books, I had to get out in it, I had to travel, meet people. Secondly is the media. You'll learn nothing from the world in the media. And I think it's these two together. Poor self-education and media is what gets people thinking or having these trains of thought. And to get away from that, we need a better regulated media that it has to be held account, can't spout lies, okay? And we need, I would say, decolonization of the curriculum. It's something that I'm for. I'm pro decolonization of the curriculum, because right now we have, Henry VIII and the Richard Plantagenets and, Henry VIII's wives and we have William the Conqueror. These are the things that we talk about. The British had slavery for what, 200-300 years, I believe slavery lasted, but they never want to talk about the 200 or 300 years and what happened in that time. They only want to focus on one man, an abolitionist called William Wilberforce, and it was just this one man that ended slavery, not a series of people. They don't want to talk about all the revolts that happened all around various parts of the Caribbean and in various parts of Africa. They don't even want to talk about that. They don't want to talk about how Toussaint Louverture kicked Napoleon's ass, how Toussaint Louverture managed to hold off the Spanish, the French, and the British navies for the best part of 11 years? And before they ended up winning the Haitians ended up winning the revolution and outlawing slavery first before Great Britain did.
Indeed, yeah. And it was only, as you say, in response to this and the fact that they realized, it doesn't make financial sense for us to continue.
Exactly that. It just wasn't financially viable. And then, of course, with the new inventions around the Industrial Revolution, it was better for them to, whatever money they got, the slave owners' compensation was invested into new technologies. And this is what drove the economy forward.
Yeah, very much so. Now, as we are going to be moving in towards, or later on in the series, talking a lot more about specific issues with regards to some of the African nations, some of the stories that you refer to. So this is kind of like a bit of an introduction and a pathway into that, and we will revisit some of these themes. It's interesting that you mentioned as well the media. And the other day, I don't know where you find the time. I really don't. I think it's brilliant, the amount of time that you can dedicate to some of the just the news stories. But you highlighted something that was written by a particular rich, white, mediocre individual, and you simply said, "Sounds like the cry of a desperate man," and talking about unfortunately, the kinds of people that control the news. Elon Musk wrote this ridiculous comment. Very few Americans realize that if Trump is not elected, this will be the last election. Now, he goes on to say some other crap as well after that. But just that sentence in itself is absolutely ridiculous.
Of course, it's absurd. If we look back on the President Trump's presidency, he was the one that's tried to subvert democracy. The very people who are trying to save democracy, the people that the DAs and the people that brought his court cases to court are the very people that he's trying to attack. Elon Musk has got this wrong. He's got this twisted. It's the opposite way around. Trump, I'm not a fan of Kamala Harris or Joe Biden, right? If they win, it's still going to be business as usual in Israel, okay? People are under this impression that if Trump gets into power, I think the positive, I'm not going to say positive, but Trump likes Putin. I believe that they get on. And I think if Trump does win, then it may see an end of what's happening in Ukraine. And that might be a positive thing. What happens in Israel, I have no idea. But it's 6 of one and half a dozen of the other, right? That's how I feel.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I mean, I've heard Israel currently be described as a settler colony? Now, I believe personally in a two-state solution. However, the current situation is so far from being a two-state solution. It couldn't possibly be further from being a two-state solution. And I genuinely believe that if you want to have a two-state solution, you need to have both of the individual states involved dedicated to that particular idea. We don't have that at all. And soon it may no longer be a viable option anyway. But yeah, we kind of started this, and you were right to point out that we want to focus more on issues which pertain to African nations. And a lot has been said about what's happening in Gaza and the genocide, and rightfully so. But yeah, so moving back towards this, the control, as it were, of the media, and the reason why I brought up Elon Musk is that whenever people from an African perspective want to talk about African interests or the interests of African people,
Yes.
That opportunity is taken away. So a few days after Blinken made this statement that African Streams is actually a mouthpiece for Putin, Meta removed it from its platform, and it denied thereafter millions of people who had access to their carefully curated news.
Yes.
That's scandalous, isn't it?
Absolutely. First of all, it is scandalous, but it's also about controlling the media, the flow of the media, right? It's about controlling the flow of information. What I actually enjoyed with the content is simply this, that they were shining a light on what's happening in Africa. We're not getting this in the mainstream news. They built up close to a million or just over 1 million followers, okay, Africa Streams. And people had a light shone on what's happening within the continent from young, vibrant people. I mean, let's look at the continent's demographic. I believe that Africa, the continent, has between 16 and 18-year-olds, I believe it's something like 40%, 70%, give or take, of the continent is under 30. That in itself is a huge resource that should be utilized. It should be utilized in a very different way. Instead of these young men who are fit and strong, having to escape persecution, war, death, famine, hunger, and making these arduous journeys to Europe to try and earn a small bit of money to send back home, these guys could be utilized back at home. The continent can become self-sufficient. It can be producing its own products and enriching the continent and the people and building for the next generation. Of course, there are vested interests that don't want it to happen. And this is exactly what Africa Streams was highlighting. They were highlighting that, look, this is what we have. But again, there are vested interests that do not want Africa to develop. And if people ask me, how do I know that? Well, I just say aid. Stop giving aid to Africa and allow Africa to develop on an even keel with everybody else. Africa could be on its feet within 15 years. With the technology that's available today, Africa could be on its feet within 15 years, and that's no time at all.
Yep, yeah, absolutely. And people listening to this, and I think also people have written to you on X and other platforms to say that, well, why doesn't Africa just do that anyway? Then what are they waiting for? Completely unaware of the fact that whenever African leaders or whenever African politicians have taken similar steps, what's the consequences?
Well, they get murdered completely. They take them out. I mean, Nelson Mandela was imprisoned, and even when he was imprisoned and he came out, he couldn't move. He couldn't do anything for his people in South Africa. Same thing happened to, we have Kwame Nkrumah in Ghana, Patrice Lumumba, Thomas Sankara, Colonel Gaddafi, the latest one. Whenever there's a visionary that wants to bring the continent forward, a continent to become self-sufficient and free from not just the US, but also European. Let's remember that France has a very, very firm grip on the Franco banking systems within the French-speaking parts of Africa, which they heavily rely on to keep their economy afloat. I mean, let me just put it another way, a very simple way. Africa is what keeps the world afloat. Africa doesn't need the world needs Africa. And this is the reason why there is so much interest within the continent. It's that simple.
Yep. And another reason, and people who are unaware of the fact that Africa is perhaps the wealthiest continent with regards to natural resources. If that were not the case, then why the hell are so many countries there? Obviously, there's a reason for them to be there, right? The facts speak for themselves.
Absolutely. I was going to say, just something that kind of flashed in my mind. When they had the Berlin conference and they decided to chop Africa into little pieces, they ensured that there were already small conflicts happening within Africa, tribal conflicts. I mean, this has happened throughout the world in very different continents throughout time, right? This is something, it isn't anything that's unique to Africa, but they ensure that they divide the lines in such a way that the conflicts would not only continue, but would heighten as a result. And this is where we have a lot of the problems certainly around the Congo and the DRC, the Sudan, Ethiopia, Eritrea, Somalia.
And I recently read a book called A Line in the Sand, and this refers, going back to the Middle East, this refers to how Britain and France basically did exactly the same thing there, dividing it up after the end of the First World War and the fall of the Ottoman Empire, and basically just to make sure that it was almost impossible for any kind of local government that would take local interests into their as their sort of primary motivation without French or British support.
That's correct, and that still kind of goes on today. I mean, a very simple example is the French-speaking African nations. If you travel down there, for every pound, dollar, euro, yen that you change, whenever they make that exchange back, when you change it into local currency, and they have to send those dollars, pounds, yens, euros to be exchanged back into the local currency. The French bank, it has to go through the French banks, and I think that the French take 40p on every pound.
Yeah, indeed. And I'm just quickly looking up the name of a book because I want to give it the accreditation that it deserves. A Fatherless People, written by Dele Ogun, and this refers to, so it's called The Secret Story of How the Nigerians Missed the Road to the Promised Land. And this was a book which was also recommended to me. And here, just for one single, very simple point that I wanted to raise is that even as late as the 1990s, the Metropolitan Police arrested a politician from Nigeria because they wanted to, in some way, directly influence the elections that were upcoming in Nigeria. So when people talk about, oh, this happened hundreds of years ago, even without assassinating the leaders that you mentioned earlier, Western interests still take a hand and they still get involved in domestic politics of other countries.
Let's also remember, right? People like to talk about how the British ended slavery, okay, and they did it out of the goodness of their hearts. If Britain ended slavery and they did it out of the goodness of their hearts, why did they back an apartheid regime in South Africa for all those years? Why didn't they stop? Why didn't they stop it? Why did Britain and America remain the two biggest investors in South Africa and were reluctant to make any changes? And why are they now backing an apartheid state in the Middle East, doing exactly the same thing if they were doing these things out of moral reasons?
Yeah, indeed. And also, why did they themselves introduce policies of segregation? I mean, Jim Crow and so on.
Absolutely. And then if you look at Britain today, I mean, Rupert Lowe from Reform, Robert Jenrick, Kemi Badenoch singling out one community in our country, which are the Muslims, and what has been allowed to take shape and part of the normal discourse here is the words of deportation and, you're not from here. This is a language that seems to have come back. And then people, and I like to tell them this when they laugh at me from time to time, they'll say, oh, you guys are uncivilized. And, I said, well, but you guys still think how your ancestors did 200 years ago. We've evolved. But you're still there. Who's civilized now, and who's uncivilized?
Yeah, absolutely. And as we go through also our series, what I think we're going to move towards, or at least what we plan to move towards, is not simply a critique of Western influence, but we also want to bring in the native positivity inherent within African communities and African nations, because we don't want this to simply fizzle into what I suppose your average white European would consider the moaning or this or that or the other, because that's obviously how their approach is. We want to talk about the positive influence which Africans have had on society within African nations, but also in other areas as well. You've often referred to participation within other sectors, technologies, and so on. Yeah, go on. Sorry.
No, I was going to say absolutely, absolutely. There are some definitely positive sides. I mean, we can sit here and talk about all the bad things that's happened, but like Africa Stream, and this it's our job to inform and let people know that there are some great things happening in Africa, and there are a lot of people that want things to happen and want the continent to move, and I'm one of those people, right? If people really want to stop refugees, if people are worried about resources being used, if people are worried about strain on housing as they're being told, which I believe is not really a problem, but hey, these are the lies that we're told. If people really genuinely believe these are issues that we need sorting, we'll petition the government to stop making these people impoverished in their countries, and then they'll stay. So let's talk about what's there and how we can encourage that to blossom.
Yeah. And one of those positive things, which isn't a new positive thing, because I believe it's been around at least for the last 60 or 70 years. I don't know exactly where the origins are. But for me, one of these very positive things is the idea of Pan-Africanism. For me, this is an extremely positive movement. But people have to realize that this is a threat to Western interests. And so there is a reason why this movement hasn't perhaps reached the state that it should have done.
Yeah, unfortunately, I think the biggest problem is the capitalist system. Okay, in every country we have a system where the system depends on growth. It's got to continually growing year on year and year out. If suddenly your revenue stream dries up over here, here, and here, and here, you're not going to get the growth you need. So there is a vested interest to stop that from happening. So Pan-Africanism, while it's good for the continent, it's good for the world, I believe that the countries that have a vested interest in stopping that from happening are very short-sighted in their view. And I don't want to single out people point and say, oh, you just keep talking about Europe. Yes, the Chinese are there as well. I think India's now starting to make moves there too. The Russians are there also making moves, but hey, let's have a look at who was there historically and still have very much of a stronghold, and let's have a look at who's doing what down there. I believe that the US has increased AFRICOM and put more military bases in Africa, while the Chinese are building roads and infrastructure that's going to benefit the people. So
what's also interesting is that the pure hypocrisy of the political right, I would say, in Western democracies, because on the one hand, domestically speaking, they are talking against allowing people from African nations to come to countries like the UK, but internationally, they're running policies which don't allow African societies to grow, thereby keeping those people where they want to be.
Absolutely. I think it's actually quite sad that it is that way. And this is something that we've got to talk more about, because I believe that we are only getting one side of the story. So we need to talk more about how they're prevented from actually developing, how they're prevented from, and also we've also got the brain drain, right? I mean, you do have some excellent engineering that has come out of Africa, certainly in the tech world, and as soon as American or European companies find people, they pull them out of Africa and put them, within well-paid jobs in the US or well-paid jobs in Europe.
Yeah. Now, in Europe, we've often complained about the brain drain going from here to the USA. But obviously, Europe plays the same game when it can to other areas. Perhaps they don't invest so much as the Americans do, and that's why Europe usually works out as being a stepping stone to further greatness away from European shores. But that has two effects. It enriches Europe or American innovation, and it impoverishes the indigenous or the native country of that individual.
Absolutely. I think, and this is where Africa fails. I think that Africa is lacking democratic institutions that can help to implement some of the processes that can help the continent or the various countries within the continent, move at a certain rate. Rwanda is a great test case. Rwanda, Kenya. I mean, these places have developed extremely, it's amazing, beautiful. Ivory Coast are very similar. Ghana's definitely there. Nigeria has a lot of money, and there are parts of it that's very, very well developed. And I think that There needs to be more institutions that can at least be the catalyst to move forward. But I think the continent itself needs more. It needs to rid itself of leaders that are West friendly, that do nothing for their people, that take bundles of money to turn a blind eye so big organizations can access their resources. I think that needs to change.
Yeah. And then going back, if possible, towards a point that you raised earlier about the demographic of Africa. By contrast, I believe I read somewhere that by 2050, China will have 400 million pensioners. In the UK and in Europe, the baby boomers have started to retire.
Yep.
So how can I say, the productive output of a lot of these countries is going to be so severely reduced over the next 10, 15, 20 years' time. One of the only regions with actual active potential is going to be these African nations.
Absolutely. As I said, the human capital there is phenomenal. With such a young population, I think they're approaching 1 billion people in Africa, right? 800 to 900 million, give or take, something like that. It has enormous potential, and I believe, on a level, the Chinese see this, and they're already working towards that, because, as you just quite rightly pointed out, 400 million pensioners are going to be within China within a few years, or in the coming years. They're probably looking ahead. We already know the Chinese plan 40 to 50 years ahead. They're not like us. Our leaders only try and get us through the next election cycle, very short-term planning, and this is why we always fail at everything. But in China, they're looking at 40 to 50 years ahead, and they're probably doing exactly what needs to be done. So 30 to 40 or 50 years from now, when these things start to take form, they've already put the pieces into play, and they'll just get people organized how they want and keep the world turning.
Indeed. And so to bring the first, shall we say, introductory episode to the positive conclusion, a thought perhaps for people who have been listening, is that would it not be beneficial for Western societies to also take a positive step towards this, embracing the potential of the very near future of African demographics, and to be able to put in place the kind of relationship which will allow them to not only benefit long-term from this mutually respectful relationship, but also to allow African people to be able to benefit from the resources of their own countries, and thereby help that to be passed on in a much more sustainable manner to the rest of the world.
Absolutely, 100%. I think that we here in the West, here in this part of the world, we need to get away from looking at people who come from the Middle East or from Africa, refugees. We need to stop looking at them with suspicion, calling them criminals and murderers and rapists. A lot of these people do have skills. They're willing. Some of them speak more than one languages. In fact, they all do, and they're looking to develop. We need to look at that and see that as a positive. Work with them. Then maybe these people want to return home and then build their own continent. It's just how it is. You've got to pick positives from it. It shouldn't be negative all the time. And the world view shouldn't always be based on the Western centric ideal that we're the greatest and nothing's ever going to be better than us. The world is changing. It's changing very quickly. We have to change with it, or we're going to wither away.
Yep, absolutely. And nor should we also continue this concept of possession and keeping things. It's also nice to give back, without putting a too simplistic spin on it. The rest of the world has taken so much from the continent of Africa. At least at this point, it would be nice to start giving something back.
Absolutely. Couldn't think of a better way to end this episode, my friend.
Yeah, Esheru, I'm really looking forward to our future episodes. Let's see exactly where we can take it, how many different kinds of African nations we can put into our series. And then we'll take it from there. Thank you very much, brother.
Thank you very much for having me.
Two and a mic.